I think the first thing I'm supposed to say is, can you hear me? Yep, okay, that's fine. And it's also, thank you, I think I've been elevated to a PhD I didn't know about, but hey ho, I'm not complaining. Anyway, President, fellows and guests, let me begin by saying how delighted I am to be here today to talk to you about St Kilda. Truth be told, this is the third of 5 presentations I'm giving on St Kilda in as many weeks, but it's the only one outside of Edinburgh where we're based, and the only one to which I've had to invite myself. But I am not complaining. But back to here and now. For today's purposes, I've structured things into 3 parts. So I'll begin by saying a little bit about St Kilda itself and why we got involved, then some words on our survey and what we found, and then finally why we wrote our book and our aims and aspirations of publishing. This means that the title, Mapping a Future for the Past, will consider mapping in the literal sense of our own field survey, and that's equivalent of part 2, and more metaphorically in the publication, that's part 3, where we wanted to dispel some myths and romanticism surrounding St Kilda by mapping or charting a very different approach to our understanding of the archaeology. But first of all, where is St Kilda? For those of you who don't know, St Kilda is a tiny group of islands cast adrift in the Atlantic Ocean, some 100 miles from the west coast of mainland Scotland and about 45 miles west of North Uist, one of the islands that formed the so-called Long Island, otherwise known as the Western Isles or Outer Hebrides. And as you can see here, you can't miss it because it's shown by a big yellow arrow. The archipelago comprises 4 islands. There's Hurta, Doon, Soay and Borroway, and 3 stacks, Levenish, which guards the approach to Village Bay, and Stack Lee and Stackenarman, both to the west of Borroway. And Hurta, which is the main island in here, with Village Bay, is what we'll be focusing for a large part throughout this talk. And Hurta, arguably, is the only island to have supported any form of permanent occupation. Some of you may also be aware that St Kilda is a World Heritage Site, and in this respect it occupies a very unique position in the UK, insofar as it's the UK's only dual World Heritage Site, and indeed one of only 35 across the globe. It holds this on account of its natural and cultural heritage, and while it is the cultural heritage designation that led to our involvement and our mapping survey, in terms of its natural heritage, the islands boast some of the highest sea cliffs in Europe, the largest colony of seabirds in northern Europe, its own subspecies of wren and woodmouse, as you see here on the left, and they also support 2 unique breeds of sheep, both rare survivals of primitive types, one of which dates back to prehistory. And it's against this fantastic natural backdrop that we can set the island's human history, which for many ended with the evacuation of the last 36 inhabitants on the 29th of August in 1930. And this is very much a view perpetuated until quite recently in such publications as Charles Maclean's Island on the Edge of the World. However, and contrary to popular belief, the last islanders actually petitioned the UK government to assist them to leave and to help them to find new lives on the Scottish mainland. So they were not forcibly evicted from their homes. This was no Highland clearance, but rather they wanted to go. So poignant though this moment may be, it is just one part of the remarkable story of St Kilda, a story which we'll soon see stretches back into prehistory and still continues today. And just as a brief aside, I just wanted to mention that it's very well documented that some of the St Kildans, when they were evacuated from the island, they actually got employment with the Forestry Commission on the Artornish Peninsula in Argyll. And I think it's always quite poignant as well to imagine how strange this must have been for them, coming from an island which was treeless to actually working with trees. Some of them had never actually seen a tree before. But far from this being the last human presence on Hurta in 1957, the 5th Marquess of Bute bequeathed the archipelago to the National Trust for Scotland, and almost simultaneously the Ministry of Defence established a radar tracking station in Village Bay on Hurta, the main island of the group. This is still part of a missile testing range operating from Benbecula in the Outer Hebrides, and while staff numbers to service the range have dropped significantly over the years, a complement of around 20 still reside on the island, albeit on a temporary and rotational basis. Their continuing presence effectively made our own survey there logistically possible. So, having acquired St Kilda in the late 1950s, the National Trust for Scotland took this forward and championed its designation as a World Heritage Site, leading to its first inscription by UNESCO in 1986 on account of its natural heritage. This was extended in 2004 to incorporate the surrounding marine environment, and then again in 2005 in recognition of its cultural heritage. But more importantly, this most recent inscription from UNESCO carried with it a commitment to undertake a mapping survey and create a historic environment record of the cultural landscape of St Kilda. Ultimately, by knowing the geographical locations of the archaeological remains, the National Trust would be better placed to monitor and manage the cultural resource. And this is where we, then the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Scotland, came into the frame. So it was the year after, in 2006, and in response to this request from the World Heritage Committee, that the Commission was approached by the National Trust and invited to undertake a joint 3-year archaeological survey project. This began in 2007 and involved 2 10-day trips each year until 2009, when work on the main island of Hurta was completed. Subsequent trips have been undertaken to Doon, Soay and Borroway, and we'll discover more about our trip to Borroway in due course. Our partnership project with the National Trust worked at many different levels, and like all good partnerships, there have to be benefits for all concerned. For the Commission, this provided us with the opportunity to build on previous survey work undertaken in the 1980s, as well as to integrate and upgrade and enhance the existing records of the sites and monuments. But perhaps more importantly, it allowed us to fulfil our remit, which is to survey and record the built heritage of Scotland. And by way of their contribution, the National Trust provided us with logistical support and funding. So aside from the project board meetings, the necessary evil, ensuring the timely management and delivery of the survey, much of this support was provided and coordinated behind the scenes by Susan Bain, the National Trust property manager. In particular, the National Trust provided us with transport to and from Harris to St Kilda, accommodation in the converted cottages on the island, which you see here top left, all our food during the stay, and of course the all-important cook. Transport for ourselves, our equipment and our provisions came in the shape of the Orca, skippered by Angus Campbell, some of us surviving the journey better than others. For whatever reason, most of my last fieldwork projects have been spent on 10-day trips to increasingly more remote islands. Quite what my colleagues are trying to tell me, I'm not entirely sure, but like the proverbial bad penny, I keep returning. But if I was to put this in more context, I should confess perhaps that I have neither a head for heights nor a stomach for long boat trips. So for me, getting to the islands has always been a tortuous affair, and most of my journeys have been spent hanging over the side of the boat, saying goodbye to the contents of my stomach. But, as the saying goes, every cloud has a silver lining, and for me that meant that for the last few trips to St Kilda, I travelled by helicopter. 25 minutes compared with 3 hours in a boat crashing through waves with a 6-metre swell. Well, I'm afraid there is no comparison. The only downside was having to squeeze into this giant tangerine-coloured romper suit under the pretext of survival, and getting out was certainly no easier. But before we move on, perhaps the final word to say about partnership may appear to be simply a matter of common sense and not worth stating. Nonetheless, it is extremely important, as the success of the project hinges on teamwork and cooperation, and that goes from loading the gear on and off the boat, to checking over the data following a busy day in the field, to even fighting over who gets to wear the marigolds to do the washing up. The evacuation of St Kilda in 1930 and the perception of abandonment that was affected by this is well rehearsed in the literature, but I suspect few people will be aware that Hurta was the last inhabited island to be mapped and published by the Ordnance Survey, having been omitted from the coverage of Harris and North Uist some 50 years earlier. For St Kilda, the first Ordnance Survey map appeared in 1928 and was based on mapping work undertaken the previous year by one of its retired officers, John Matheson. And this always strikes me as sadly ironic, as it was only 3 years before the islanders left for their new lives on the mainland. So while St Kilda's isolated position has attracted countless generations of seafarers, their very remoteness has done little to inspire map makers. For us embarking on the survey, this seemed all the more remarkable, as with over 700 publications, be it articles, maps and journals, already written about St Kilda, there was not an accurate map of the features at the beginning of the 21st century. So prior to our survey, it would be fair to say, at least I think it is, that the locations of St Kilda's archaeological remains were known only schematically, having been drawn from a combination of local knowledge and sketches, and plotted onto photocopies of the Ordnance Survey maps dating from the 1970s. So this is really hardly the best starting position for a World Heritage Site, I'm sure you'll agree. So our primary objective was to establish the positions of the archaeological features, and here our approach was to combine global positioning survey equipment, as you see now, together with high-definition rectified aerial photography, which provides the backdrop that you see on screen at the moment. This is a section of the area at the east end of Village Bay, with the military base outlined in purple, and that's bottom left, and the cottages and cleats shown in red. Ultimately, the combination of satellite and digital technology means that we can now claim to have mapped the archaeological remains accurately and to within centimetres, in effect depicting traces of human occupation on the islands, dating from the later prehistory right through to the present day. And for the Commission, this was an opportunity, as I've already mentioned, to build on previous survey work undertaken in the 1980s and published as the Buildings of St Kilda, albeit that the work undertaken then was carried out using a very different survey methodology and at a more detailed scale. The 1980s survey was undertaken at 1 to 500 and by self-reducing alidade, as opposed to the 1 to 2500 mapping scale of the present survey. At a practical level, the areas already covered in the 1980s were digitised in office, georeferenced in the field, and ultimately incorporated into the more recent survey data, resulting in the plan you see before you now. We also referenced a 1 to 10,000 sketch plot of the cleats on Hurta, which was drawn up by Mary Harman, who had recorded the cleats as part of her own research project in the late 1970s. Mary's work on the cleats and the numbering sequence that she introduced provided us with the best possible start. She recorded over 1,200 cleats on Hurta, and this in itself is an incredible piece of work. How she managed to plot that number of cleats onto photocopies of 1 to 10,000 map sheets is surely an incredibly skillful piece of observation and mapping. Her recording of each cleat is a lesson to us all in adopting a systematic approach to data capture, and her photographs of each cleat provided a lifeline to us in the field when we were trying to identify and map them, the cleats. We also benefited from her presence in the field when she joined us on one of her 6 field trips, and here you see her, hands on hips, keeping the boys in check. I also mentioned earlier that the most recent inscription of the cultural heritage from UNESCO carried with it a commitment not only to undertake a mapping survey, but also to create a historic environment record. So in tandem with the mapping survey, we also undertook to upgrade and enhance the existing records of the sites and monuments, much of which we recorded into a computer database via our field notebooks. This contains information on all the structures, but specifically the cleats, and you can see a screenshot of of the database at the moment. And as another brief aside, I have mentioned and underlined the importance of team working But that's not to say there was never a competitive edge to our work. And I think it would be fair to say that cleat bagging became a bit of a challenge for some of us. But I am happy to report that I hold the record of having recorded 65 in one day's shift. I may not cover the ground quite as quickly as my male colleagues, but I definitely have a lot more stamina for all these boring things. Anyway, here you see what I call the dream team in action. Our surveyor, Ian Parker, the National Trust archaeologist Jill Harden, she's photographing the site, and myself noting the remains. It means that on the ground we worked in teams of 3, and this proved a very efficient and effective way of covering the ground and recording as we went along. The surveyor plotted the features with the GPS kit, the investigator noted the feature, and the National Trust archaeologist verified the number with reference to Mary's photographs of the 1970s, and at the same time updating the photographic record with 4 views working clockwise from the entrance. And funnily enough, when I was putting together the images, it struck me that since we'd undertook our survey, both Jill and Ian have retired. I'm not quite sure what that says, but the best I could come up with to say was perhaps retirement for some of us is like St Kilda, a very distant prospect. Anyway, that's enough of the survey methodology. What about the cultural landscape? I suspect for most people arriving in Village Bay today, they feel offended by the flat-roofed forest green blocks of the 20th century defence installations, and are in denial of the island's reoccupation as a radar tracking station since 1957. But incongruous though they might be, they are nevertheless part of the island's continuing human story, and are perhaps under the most immediate threat with the possibility of the base on Benbecula being run down. And set beside them are the ruins of the 19th century dwellings and outbuildings. These are strung out along the so-called street like beads on a necklace, each with a thin strip of land running below to the shoreline and above to the head dyke, the boundary that divided the agricultural land from the rough grazing. These were the homes of the last St Kildans, and 6 have been restored, and they're the ones with the black bitumen roofs. And these provided the accommodation for us during our own survey work, as well as the many work parties that attend to ongoing conservation work. And that is the head dyke running along there. And there we've got the cottages with the street in front, and these are the croft boundaries running from the street down to the foreshore and then up towards the head dyke. So far, we've heard quite a lot about cleats, so it should come as no surprise then to learn that they are by far the most numerous structures to be found on the islands, with more than 1,400 now mapped and recorded on Hurta alone. Cleats are multi-purpose dry stone storehouses, basically stone sheds, and they're unique to St Kilda, used for the drying and storage of seabirds, eggs, peats and crops. Architecturally, they have a roughly rectangular plan, narrow enough to be spanned by a roof of stone lintels. These were capped by cut turves, though many have been eroded or simply stripped clean by the Atlantic gales. Cleats are most commonly built on a slope, with the entrance at the higher end, and on occasion a drain in the lower courses of the downslope end. And here you see what we called the traditional end loaders, that's left and bottom right, and what we called a side loader, top right. Some are spread across the steep grass slopes, some form neat rows running along the cliff tops, and others stand alone in splendid isolation and in the most unlikely locations. The dates of the cleats are not known, but they were clearly a type of structure built and used over several centuries. And indeed some are annotated as pyramids on Martin Martin's early map of 1697, while others were not constructed until the late 19th or early 20th centuries. And we know this by comparing photographs from the late 19th century with those that date from the early 20th century. Whatever their date, though, the cleats epitomised the resourcefulness of the St Kildans, for not only did they have to grow their crops, gather seabirds and cut peats, they also had to store them appropriately to ensure supplies throughout the long winter months. And as we discovered, every cleat has a story to tell. Of the 100 or so within the head dyke on Village Bay, one incorporates an early Christian cross and size stone in its roof. Another is reputed to have been originally the home of Lady Grange, who was imprisoned on the island for 8 years from 1734 by her nasty husband, concerned that she might expose his Jacobite sympathies. Finding and producing food on St Kilda, though, stretches much back further than the cleats. People have lived on the archipelago since prehistoric times, exploiting the rich resources of the sea, growing crops and keeping animals. Quite when the first settlers pulled their boats up onto the foreshore is unknown, but 2 shards of Neolithic pottery discovered in 1996 by Andrew Fleming and Mark Edmonds on the eroding cliff edge in Village Bay provide an indication of an early presence. These shards have diagonal incised decoration on the reverted rims, in keeping with wares from the Hebrides, and examples of which are paralleled at such sites such as Elan and T on North Uist. And hopefully you could make out the decoration in here and here, and how it compares with the incised lines over there. And to these can be added pollen grains preserved in the Hurta peat that reveal that the first cereal crops were being grown shortly before 3000 BC. But where were they cultivating? Well, the survey found plenty of new evidence for the fields and stone tools that supported an arable economy. There is still much debate about their extent and date. Fragments of stone tools are incorporated into the consumption dykes, and heaps of field clearance from the croft plots, and just as many, if not more, of the stone tools have been found recycled into the walls of later buildings, especially the cleats. Indeed, the earliest securely dated context for the stone tools comes from structures belonging to the Iron Age. Traces of earlier field boundaries can be seen above and below the head dyke of the later Village Bay crofts, but how far back in time they go remains unknown. Recorded systematically for the first time during the survey, they are one of the most interesting outcomes from the project, and a reminder of what can be found in an area already well trodden by field workers and visitors alike. And the early remains are shown in black in this map, with the much later remains in a faint, rather brown, which I suspect is invisible to those sitting at the back. Our own survey on Hurta threw up some other unexpected results, though, not least the discovery of another early Christian cross and size stone. This was found between 2 houses on the street and is now used as the cover slab of a drain. Inevitably, it was found on the last morning of one of our trips when everything was packed away and the rest of the team were about to depart by boat. So luckily, I was left behind as I was going off by helicopter, and I managed to improvise to do the rubbing with some greaseproof paper and a thick black crayon. Two such stones are already known from the island, one built into the wall of another cottage, and the other incorporated into the roof of a cleat, as we saw a moment ago. And I've no doubt that there are many more awaiting their moment of discovery. But if all good things come in threes, then the final unexpected result I want to showcase is one from the lowermost slopes overlooking the bay on the north side of Hurta. Here we found at least 4 new buildings, all bow-sided and set along the slope. On plan, they are different from any of the other buildings we have recorded, be it cottage, black house or bothy, leaving us in some sort of interpretative limbo when it comes to their date and function. My own feeling is that they have been roofed, perhaps even partly corbelled, and their state of preservation suggests that they might be relatively recent, but equally their location on the lowermost slopes on ground that hasn't been cultivated could argue for their survival from an even earlier date. So until now, though I've been talking of St Kilda, I've really only been discussing Hurta, which, as you know, is but one of the islands of the archipelago. The team have also been across to Borroway and Soay, and here the National Trust consulted Stuart Murray, who provided expert guidance and support to the teams in getting on and off the islands. And that's Stuart in the pink t-shirt on the left, leading the way up the rock face on Borroway, and on the right holding one of the poles that were used originally to snare the seabirds. Borroway is the most remote island of the group and has long been regarded as a satellite of Hurta, a view maintained until the early 20th century, when the St Kildans would visit during the summer months, seafouling and plucking sheep wool, staying in the bothies and storing their catch in the cleats. It was in 2009, the final year of our original project, when the Commission staff made a brief foray to Borroway. Brief because the weather closed in and the wind began to whip up, forcing the team to withdraw after only a few hours. For my colleagues making the trip to Borroway, it brought home just how much the St Kildans were at the mercy of the wind and waves, and for those of us left behind on Hurta, it highlighted the emotional angst faced by the women watching and waiting to see whether their husbands and sons, and in this case their male colleagues, made it back home safely. But another opportunity arose in 2010, and a team of 5 spent a week on Borroway mapping and recording the archaeological remains, camping amongst the cleats as they did so. Much of these are to be found on the long grassy slope facing the southwest that plunges steeply into the sea, demanding not just a good head for heights, but also having one leg longer than the other. And as work progressed, it soon became clear that here too there were the remains of a complex field system, stretching across a steep slope and incorporating cultivation terraces, garden plots and lazy beds. And on screen at the moment you can see the survey data depicted against the orthorectified aerial photographs, just as we've already seen for Village Bay on Hurta. And interestingly enough, the uppermost extent of the field system appears to be bounded by a head dike, similar to the predecessor of the stone-walled head dike in Village Bay. Dating, as ever, remains an issue. However, on Borroway at least, the boundaries of the field system are consistently the earliest, with the cleats and bothies routinely seen to overlie them. And Borroway too generated some excitement with the discovery of 3 settlement mounds, one of which is shown here, underlies a cleat and incorporates a dry stone cell with a seemingly intact corbelled roof. This is strongly reminiscent of the so-called Amazon's house on Hurta, for which an early medieval date has been mooted. Tempting it is too to view the settlement mounds and the field system as contemporary features, though the relationship between the two could not be firmly established on the ground. Irrespective of this, however, both suggest an early attempt at permanent occupation and cultivation. So looking ahead, beyond both the survey and the publication, it's hoped that Stuart Murray will provide further assistance to the survey teams when attempts are made to gain access onto the sea stacks of Stack Lee and Stack in Armagh. One bothy is recorded on Stack Lee, and that's that one there, while 76 cleats and a bothy have been recorded on Stack in Armagh. So as well as good sea legs, this will require considerable rock climbing expertise, which thankfully rules me out on both counts. So that's a very concise summary of our survey results. For us though, they go beyond simply adding to the corpus of archaeological structures and georeferencing them onto a map. Rather, they challenged old interpretations and reveal new insights into a landscape too long viewed as the epitome of a remote and primitive society. If St Kilda has a story to tell, it is of endurance and perseverance, and that much became obvious to us during the course of our survey. The St Kildans cultivated the ground, tended their stock, and harvested seabirds, just as other remote communities across the western and northern Isles of Scotland. In many ways, they were more similar than they were different, and indeed the harvesting of young gannets or guga is still carried out to this day on the remote island of Sulisgear by the men of Ness from the northwest Lewis, and this is what you can see on the right here. And this takes us very neatly to the third part of today's talk, the publication itself. Having already stated that there are over 700 books, articles and maps on St Kilda, You may well wonder, why were we bothering, and what on earth was there more to tell? Well, apart from the obvious answer that you all need to buy a copy of the book and find out, what we wanted to do was to create a new narrative that reconsiders St Kilda's peripheral position, and a narrative that challenged the notions of insularity and isolation. So the focus was not so much on St Kilda looking in, but on St Kilda looking out. And this image, in my mind, very neatly encapsulates this notion by standing on the slopes overlooking Village Bay and looking across the sea and beyond. So until now, we've all been seduced by the story of this island on the edge of the world, to quote again the well-rehearsed title from Charles MacLean's book, and the tales of an iconic island, to quote that of Andrew Fleming. And I say this with some amount of trepidation now, knowing that he's sitting in the audience tonight. And indeed, the strapline for our own title is the anglicised translation of Hector Boyce's first description of St Kilda, the last and outmost eel. And this too very much reinforces St Kilda's distant location. But while accepting this geographical position, we wanted instead to offer a reappraisal of its remoteness, but not in terms of marginality and distance, but more in terms of its connectivity and links with a much wider world. More ambitiously, perhaps, we wanted to bring the story up to date and to include the later 20th century. For too many people, the evacuation of St Kilda on the 29th of August 1930 was the end of life on the islands, but just as there had been a smallpox epidemic in 1727, this too had occasioned major change and repopulation, and so too did this event. To this end, we've also included the later 20th century military presence as a separate chapter, recognising the impact that this has made on the landscape, together with that of the National Trust, who now own and manage the islands. So connectivity with the wider world and bringing the story up to the present day are two of the main themes explored in our book. The third is that of survival and destruction. For my own part, I am a prehistorian by training, but the nature of our work means that we do have to cover all periods and all types of landscapes, from the prehistoric hut circle landscapes of Perthshire to the industrial mining remains of 19th century Ayrshire. And as I've already noted, for me, working on St Kilda brought many challenges, personally and professionally, not only confronting the drama of the landscape, the steep slopes and the sheer cliffs, but also the recognition that this physical geography had constrained areas for settlement and cultivation. So just as there is the inevitable bias in the historical records, so too is there one in the archaeological record. The continual reuse and reoccupation of the same areas of ground mean that the chances of finding prehistory, my main area of interest, have become severely reduced over time. But all was not lost, and I've already mentioned the importance of working together in teams, pooling resources, sharing experiences and interests. And in this respect, and before I really started to put pen to paper, we had the good fortune of having George Geddes join our landscape survey team, fresh from his post as the National Trust St Kilda archaeologist, and that's George here. His knowledge of St Kilda, his interests outside prehistory, and his familiarity with the extensive archive material held by the National Trust were all instrumental in shaping this publication. As well as authorship, this archive material is used throughout and is showcased in more detail in the section introduced by a series of thematic essays covering the landscape, the St Kildans themselves, and I've shown two images, archive images, here on the left. We've also seen the seasons, tourism, the evacuation, the military occupation, and a section on the expeditions. So it would be fair comment then to say that our interests are complementary. Before the luxury of travelling by helicopter, though, reaching St Kilda has always involved travel by boat and across open water. And this is as true today as it has been throughout history and prehistory. Working in North Uist a few years ago, I was struck at how close St Kilda seems, the dark silhouettes of Hurta and Borroway rising up on the distant horizon. And it brought home to me the visible connections between the islands, and that this intervisibility to and from the Outer Hebrides is immensely important. And while we only have faint glimpses of an early presence, these two shards of Neolithic pottery, seeing land must have been what inspired St Kilda's first visitors. And I think this is such a fantastic image with the gleaming water. I had to use it tonight. But that's not to deny St Kilda its position. And in writing this book, it became increasingly apparent to us all that for any settlement or human presence to be sustainable for any length of time, both economically and socially, this could only ever have been achieved if the islands were part of a much wider and more complex network of relationships and dependencies. So, while writing a chronological narrative, we've also considered St Kilda within the context of the Western Isles, and in some cases further afield. So each chapter then discusses sites we believe to be relevant, and is accompanied by distribution maps. For much of its recent history, St Kilda was effectively part of a farm, along with the island of Pabby, owned by the MacLeod chiefs based at Dunvegan on Skye. Arguably, the archaeology in Pabby is better preserved and just as important, but it is an island that's neglected in the literature and lacks the romanticism of a long boat trip and a dramatic cliff-bound coastline. It also means that we've revealed similarities where they exist, situating St Kilda within a broader geographical framework, but at the same time we've not shied away from highlighting the unique. There's no doubt that the archaeological remains on St Kilda are indeed exceptional, and in the case of the many hundreds of cleats, they represent a very unique response to a very remarkable landscape. The fouling economy and the features associated with it have all been part and parcel of the St Kilda's daily lives from at least the 16th century. They are testament to the resilience and character of a people who made a living on the most dangerous and difficult group of islands. But like all good books with a beginning, a middle and an end, this has been as much a story of myself as it has been of St Kilda. As a young girl, I too had bought into the myth and romanticism of this lost and lonely place, and never for the life of me thought that I would ever have the chance to go there myself, better still, get paid to do it, and then more amazingly write a book about it. It really is hard to believe that there is still so much to discover on such a small group of islands that has already been so well recorded in the literature. So the data gathered during the survey has been made available to the public, both online through our website Canmore and in our book, which has just been reprinted in paperback. Our book was shortlisted for a British Archaeological Award, though we lost out in July to that produced on Welsh Slate, published by our sister organisation, the Royal Commission on the Ancient and Historical Monuments of Wales. But we've also been shortlisted in the history category for a Saltire Literary Award, which is Scotland's foremost annual award that celebrates and supports literary and academic excellence. So fingers crossed for that ceremony on the 24th of November. But finally, I want to return to the title, Mapping a Future for the Past. The accolade of World Heritage Site comes with the obligation to protect, conserve and present the cultural heritage for future generations. For St Kilda, this means that the current owner, the National Trust for Scotland, also has to work in partnership with other organisations, including Historic Environment Scotland, the Ministry of Defence, Scottish Natural Heritage and the Western Isles Council. And representatives from all organisations are seen here signing the current 5-year management plan in Benbecula in 2012, 82 years after the evacuation of the island in 1930. So taking the title literally, having now accurately mapped the archaeology of St Kilda, the National Trust had been provided with a tool that will help them manage this truly remarkable legacy, ensuring its protection long after we've departed and hopefully for a long time to come. And taking the title in its more metaphorical sense, by writing our book, we hope that readers will reconsider St Kilda and its geographical position, not as isolated and remote, but as part of a much wider world. And in this respect, St Kilda's isolation is a description and not an explanation. Thank you.